Welcome to the Deep Dive. We look at the key reports, the important research, and try to boil it down for you. And today, well, we're starting with a number that honestly just stops you cold. 458,000 people. That's how many were victims of homicide globally in 2021. It's a massive figure, obviously, but behind it is just this immense human cost.
It really is. And maybe to frame it even better, think about this. That number, 458,000 homicides. It's actually more than the deaths from all armed conflicts and terrorism combined in that same year.
Wow, more than conflict and terrorism.
Yeah. The figures were around 440,000 homicides versus 94,000 conflict deaths and maybe 22,000 from terrorism.
That completely changes the perspective, doesn't it? It suggests maybe our focus on global threats is, well, maybe a bit skewed.
It certainly suggests homicide is this pervasive, almost silent crisis compared to the headlines conflict and terror get.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we're digging into the latest global study on homicide 2023 from the UNODC. And we're also looking at some focused insights on organized crime, especially its impact in places like Latin America. Our goal here is to get behind those stark numbers, understand the patterns, and, really grasp the consequences, particularly where these criminal groups are so dominant. Right, let's start with that sheer scale again. Almost 500,000 people killed in just 1 year. Where is this happening most?
Well, the breakdown is pretty sobering. In 2021, the Americas are actually highest with 176,000 victims.
186,000, okay.
And Africa with 154,000, Asia had 109,000, Europe around 17,000, and Oceania about 1,000.
And who are the victims primarily?
Demographically, it's striking. 81% were male. That's a huge majority.
81%, yeah.
But, and this is heartbreaking, 19% were children. So it cuts across all ages, really. It's not just one group being affected.
So the big question then is why? Why are these numbers so incredibly high, especially, as you said, in the Americas? What's the engine behind this violence?
And this is where the UNODC report gets really specific and, frankly, quite alarming. It points the finger directly at organized crime and gangs as the main driver, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean.
The main driver, not just a contributing factor.
The primary driver, yeah. The study actually describes homicides linked to organized crime as significantly more volatile than other kinds of violence. So we're not talking about, random fights or domestic disputes escalating, although those happen too. This is different. It's structured. It feels almost strategic.
Strategic terror, as you put it earlier. To really understand that driving force, is there a case study, a specific example that helps illustrate just how deep this runs?
Absolutely. I think to really get a handle on it, you have to look at the situation in Mexico, the so-called Mexican drug war. It's described as an ongoing asymmetric armed conflict, which basically means it's not a traditional war. The state is fighting groups that don't play by any conventional rules.
Right, much harder to combat. When did that really kick off?
Officially, you can date it to December 11, 2006. That's when President Felipe Calderón sent, I think it was 6,500 troops into Michoacán.
Okay.
And it escalated quickly. By 2008, there was something like 45,000 troops involved. Calderón himself said the goal was to dismantle the cartels because, in his words, they were trying to replace the government.
Replace the government. That's a chilling statement. So beyond the military actions and the political statements, what does this mean for ordinary people just trying to live their lives there?
I mean, it's been called a humanitarian tragedy, and the numbers back that up. Between 2006 and 2022, estimates suggest criminal violence, mostly tied to the drug trade, cost around 480,000 lives in Mexico.
480,000.
And over 120,000 people just disappeared, missing.
Unbelievable. And you mentioned it's mostly tied to drugs, but is it only drugs?
Not at all. That's a crucial point. The cartels have diversified massively. They're deep into human trafficking, extortion, kidnapping, illegal mining, even stealing massive amounts of petroleum. They call it huachicol. And sometimes the money they make from smuggling people, from human trafficking, can actually be as much or even more than they make from drugs. It's like they've infiltrated every possible illicit market.
And the way they operate. The methods they use, I understand they're designed to be terrifying.
Oh, absolutely. It's calculated cruelty, really. They use incredibly gruesome tactics, almost military-style strategies sometimes. We see public killings, torture is common, they use high-caliber weapons, even things like drones and IEDs, improvised explosive devices.
IEDs, like in a war zone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they don't hide it. They'll broadcast executions online, display bodies publicly, hang them from bridges with warning messages. It's all about spreading fear, asserting control.
And the effect of that must be just paralyzing for communities.
Completely. It disrupts everything. Daily life, legitimate businesses can't function properly. And, it creates this feeling, this public perception that the authorities have just lost control.
Which leads to the next point, doesn't it? When you have criminal groups operating with that much power and impunity, what does it do to the actual structures of governance, to the state itself?
Yeah, this is where it gets really insidious. The level of corruption and the weakening of government institutions is, well, it's profound. These organizations actively, systematically corrupt or intimidate law enforcement.
Yeah.
And not just local cops. We're talking municipal, state, even federal levels.
Even federal?
Yes. There have been reports, credible reports, of infiltration and corruption even within parts of the Mexican military. So despite government crackdowns and efforts, corruption is still a massive problem. You literally have cases of police officers acting as enforcers for the cartels.
So they're working for both sides, essentially.
Or just one side, really. It's led to purges, arrests of high-ranking officials. It shows just how deep the rot can go.
And this must put anyone trying to uphold the law or even just report on what's happening in incredible danger.
Absolutely. That raises the critical question. Who is most vulnerable in this kind of environment? Politicians, for one, especially local mayors and officials. They're deliberately targeted. The goal is to weaken local government, gain control of police forces, get access to government contracts, that sort of thing.
Makes sense. Control the local power structure.
Exactly. But it goes beyond that. The actual policies used to fight the cartels, especially heavy military intervention, they've had serious human rights consequences too.
Yeah.
There are numerous accusations against security forces: physical abuse, sexual violence, extortion, illegal arrests, torture, even extrajudicial killings.
So the response itself creates victims.
It can, yeah. And often, it's the most vulnerable groups, like indigenous communities, who are disproportionately caught in the middle or targeted by both sides.
It's just awful to think about. And you mentioned people reporting on it. Journalists, activists, they're targeted too, aren't they?
Precisely. And it's not just a side effect. It seems quite deliberate. The killing of human rights defenders, environmental activists, community leaders, aid workers, it accounts for a significant chunk of global homicides, maybe 9% or so.
9% globally. Wow.
And again, Latin America and the Caribbean stand out. Over 1,900 human rights defenders were killed there between 2015 and 2022. That's more than 60% of the global total in that period.
Yeah, 60%.
And Mexico, specifically, is consistently ranked as one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a journalist. Many are killed just for covering crime news. It's even reached the point where bloggers, people using social media to speak out against the cartels, they've been targeted and murdered too.
So it's an assault on truth itself, on any kind of accountability.
It really is. It signals a fundamental challenge to any sort of independent voice or scrutiny.
Moving beyond the immediate violence, the corruption, the human rights abuses, what about the long-term economic damage? How does this kind of pervasive criminality twist an entire economy?
Well, the data suggests that underlying issues like widespread poverty and big economic disparities, they're definitely key factors that create fertile ground. Like a lack of decent jobs creates this youth underclass, sometimes called ninis, kids who aren't studying or working. They become prime recruits for cartels.
Driven by lack of opportunity.
Lack of opportunity, maybe a desire for belonging, for status, even if it's incredibly dangerous. And the broader security situation, when it gets this bad, it directly drags down the country's GDP. The economic influence of the cartels themselves is just immense. One estimate from 2012 suggested they directly employed over 450,000 people.
Directly employed.
Yes. And another 3.2 million livelihoods were somehow dependent on the drug trade. In some cities, like Ciudad Juarez back then, maybe up to 60% of the entire local economy was thought to rely on illicit money.
So it's like this huge shadow economy running alongside or even intertwined with the legal one.
Exactly. It's deeply intertwined. And it's global, of course. Billions of dollars get laundered, often from the U.S., by these Mexican groups and their suppliers every year.
Billions laundered. How does that even happen on such a scale?
Well, shockingly, major international banks have been caught up in it. Wachovia, HSBC, they've paid massive fines for basically facilitating the movement of drug money. It shows how the legitimate financial system can be exploited.
Right. And that points to the international dimension, the demand side. How much does drug consumption elsewhere, like in the U.S., fuel this whole cycle of violence?
It's hugely significant. The U.S. is consistently identified as the world's largest consumer of cocaine, other illicit drugs. That demand is the fundamental motivator for the business, right?
Simple economics in a grim way.
Pretty much. And look at the current opioid crisis in the U.S. It's largely fueled by fentanyl that's trafficked from Mexico, often made with precursor chemicals originally from China. This whole cross-border flow has led to really serious political discussions in the U.S. Talk about securing the border more aggressively, even designating Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations.
Designating them as terrorists.
Yes, and there's even been talk, maybe extreme talk, but talk nonetheless, of things like drone strikes against cartel targets in Mexico.
Wow, that's a major escalation.
It shows the level of concern. And the cartels aren't just focused on the U.S. market. They've expanded. They've formed alliances, these sort of informal super cartels with groups like the Italian mafia to supply drugs to Europe.
Yeah.
And they've set up major hubs elsewhere, like Vancouver in Canada is apparently a key operational center now. It's a truly global network.
So putting all this together, the scale, the deep roots of organized crime, the global connections, the corruption, what does the future hold? Are we making any headway against this, or is it getting worse?
Well, the outlook, according to the UN, isn't great. Their Sustainable Development Goal, the one aiming to have violent death rates by 2030, we're not on track to meet that, not if current trends continue.
That's discouraging.
It is. And then you have these other big global trends, megatrends, that seem to be making things worse, like climate change.
Climate change, how does that connect to homicide rates?
It seems counterintuitive, maybe, but studies are correlating projected increases in temperature, more hot days, with projected increases in homicide rates, especially in Africa and the Americas.
That's fascinating. Why would that be?
The mechanisms aren't perfectly understood, maybe resource scarcity, social stress, displacement, but the correlation appears significant. Also, rapid, unplanned urbanization, people flooding into cities without adequate infrastructure or jobs, that's also linked to more crime and violence.
Right, creates pressure points.
Exactly. Now, one counter trend is aging populations. Generally, older populations tend to have lower homicide rates, but the experts warn that this demographic shift probably won't be enough on its own to offset those other drivers pushing violence up.
So multiple complex factors, some pushing rates up, maybe one slightly pulling them down, but the overall picture is challenging.
Very challenging, yes.
Okay, so after looking at all this, the staggering numbers, the role of organized crime, the case study in Mexico, the impact on governance and human rights, the economic fallout, what's the key takeaway for someone listening to this? How should we process this?
I think the main thing is to see that this isn't just about isolated crimes. The huge homicide numbers we see globally are often the direct result of these incredibly powerful, very adaptable criminal organizations. They actively erode governments, they systematically violate human rights, they destabilize entire economies. It's a complex, deeply rooted global crisis.
And the fight to push back against these groups is clearly ongoing, and the stakes are incredibly high for peace, security, the rule of law, everywhere, really. It leaves us with a pretty difficult question, doesn't it? If these criminal organizations can infiltrate society so deeply, even challenge the authority of states, how do societies effectively regain control and restore order against such a pervasive, globalized threat?
That is the critical question, and it's one that definitely needs more attention, more understanding, and frankly, more effective action.